When 20-year-old Daniel Rivers stood on the gallows, the whole town of Copper Creek came out to watch him die. It was 1862 in the Arizona Territory, and folks treated a good hanging like a county fair. They brought picnic baskets and folding chairs, spreading blankets in the dust. Children chased each other between wagon wheels, their laughter mixing with the sound of hammers on wood. They were finishing his gallows, a sturdy piece of work, meant to last. Daniel pressed his face against the cold iron bars of his cell, watching the party form. He was innocent as a newborn calf, but that didn't matter. Not here, not now. He'd been accused of crushing Foreman Calloway's skull with a hammer, a man he'd never even spoken to. The evidence was simple, and it was a lie. His hammer, with his own initials, D.R., carved right into the handle, was found next to the body. He'd told Sheriff Garrison someone stole it from his toolkit 3 days before the murder. But in a town thirsty for justice, a poor orphan's word was worth less than the dust on his boots. "Ain't right," a voice grumbled from the window. It was old Pete, a grizzled prospector who'd known Daniel since he was a boy, all knees and elbows. That boy wouldn't hurt a fly, let alone kill a man over a gambling debt. Sheriff Garrison didn't look up from cleaning his rifle. "Evidence don't lie, Pete. Initials were on the handle." Daniel's stomach twisted itself into a cold, hard knot. He hadn't gambled a day in his life. After his parents died of fever 2 winters back, he'd had nothing but the calluses on his hands and a strong back. He worked the silver mines for scraps, slept in the church when Pastor Williams took pity on him. He never caused a lick of trouble. And now this. "How long?" Daniel whispered, his voice raspy. 2 hours till noon, Garrison said, his voice flat. "Judge Crawford wants this done and dusted before the territorial marshal gets here tomorrow." 2 hours. 120 minutes. He tried to pray, but the words felt like thorns in his throat. He was going to die for something he didn't do, and the whole world would watch and cheer. Just then, a horse whinnied, followed by the jingle of an expensive harness. Through the bars, Daniel saw a carriage pull up to the jail. It was black as a raven's wing, with gleaming brass fittings that caught the morning sun. It was the fanciest thing he'd ever seen in Copper Creek. "Well, I'll be," Pete breathed. "That's the Ashford carriage." Daniel had heard the whispers. A mysterious widow, Mrs. Victoria Ashford, had arrived 6 months ago with more money than sense and a past she never spoke of. Some said she was from back east, a society lady. Others claimed she was on the run. Everyone agreed on one thing: she asked too many questions for a proper woman. The carriage door clicked open. "This ought to be interesting," Sheriff Garrison muttered, finally setting his rifle down. Daniel's heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Hope was a dangerous thing, a fool's game. But as the door to the jailhouse swung open, a sliver of it cut through his despair. What in God's name could a rich widow possibly want with a dead man walking? Silk rustled like dry autumn leaves as Victoria Ashford swept into the jail. She was dressed head to toe in midnight blue, a string of jet buttons marching down her bodice like tiny soldiers. But it was her eyes that held you. They were the color of emeralds, and they missed nothing. She took in the dusty room, the grizzled sheriff, and finally, Daniel, locked in his cage. Her gaze was sharp, like a hawk spotting its prey from 1,000 feet up. "Sheriff Garrison," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the kind of authority that made men stand up straighter. "I understand you're planning an execution today." Garrison, flustered, scrambled to his feet, nearly knocking over his lukewarm coffee. "Yes, ma'am, Mrs. Ashford, all legal and proper. Judge Crawford signed the papers himself." Victoria's eyes shifted back to Daniel. She studied him, not with pity, but with an unnerving intensity, like he was a puzzle she was determined to solve. Most folks looked at him and saw a broke miner, a nobody. This woman looked deeper. It made his skin prickle. "What's your name, young man?" she asked, her voice softening just a fraction. "Daniel Rivers, ma'am." It came out as a croak. "And you are 20 years old?" "Yes, ma'am." She glided closer to the cell, the heels of her boots clicking a sharp rhythm on the wooden floor. Her scent, Something like lavender and rain filled the small space. "Tell me about this gambling debt. The one that supposedly got Foreman Calloway killed." Daniel's throat was as dry as a creek bed in August. "I never gambled, ma'am. Never. I never had money for foolishness like that." "Interesting." She didn't seem surprised. From a small, leather-bound purse, she produced a notebook and a silver pencil. She flipped through pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. "According to my own research, the poker game at the Silver Dollar Saloon runs every Tuesday night. High stakes. Minors regularly lose their entire week's wages. Foreman Calloway was known to be a regular player, and an even more regular winner." Sheriff Garrison shifted his weight, his boots scraping the floor. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but what's a lady like yourself doing nosing around gambling halls?" A smile touched Victoria's lips, but it was as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. "My late husband, Mr. Ashford, invested heavily in this territory's mining operations. He believed in the future of Arizona. When his business partner, Mr. Calloway, suddenly stops sending reports and then turns up dead, I tend to take notice." The words hit Daniel like a bucket of ice water. Calloway wasn't just a foreman. He was her dead husband's partner. This wasn't some random act of charity. This was business. "Now then," Victoria continued, her voice dropping, pulling both Daniel and the sheriff into her confidence. "Someone in this fine town has been stealing silver from the mine shipments, systematically, for months." Garrison's face, already weathered by the sun, went pale. That's a serious accusation, ma'am." "Indeed it is," she said, her eyes never leaving Daniel's. "Calloway discovered this theft. He found the proof, and he demanded payment for his silence. He tried to blackmail the wrong person." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "The question becomes, Sheriff, who had access to the shipping records? Who could alter the weight measurements on the manifests? And who, above all, needed Calloway silenced before the Territorial Marshal's monthly inspection, which is scheduled for tomorrow?" The puzzle pieces began to click into place in Daniel's mind, forming a picture he couldn't quite believe. Someone murdered Calloway to cover up a massive theft. But that didn't explain him. Why frame a dirt-poor mine worker? Victoria answered his unspoken question, as if she'd plucked it straight from his thoughts. "Because a poor orphan makes the perfect scapegoat. No family to ask inconvenient questions. No money for a lawyer. No one in town with any reason to doubt his guilt when the murder weapon has his initials carved right into it." The jailhouse was utterly silent, save for the relentless tick-tock of the wall clock, counting down the last 90 minutes of Daniel's life. Outside, the crowd was growing, their voices a low, restless hum. They were getting thirsty for the show. Victoria snapped her notebook shut with a sharp final sound. "Sheriff, I'm going to ask you one simple question," she said, her gaze locking onto him. "And for the sake of this town, and that boy's life, I suggest you answer me truthfully." Garrison swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Yes, ma'am." "Where exactly is Deputy Morrison right now?" The name hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Deputy Morrison, the sheriff's second in command, a man known for his quick temper and his even quicker spending at the saloon. Victoria's leather notebook landed on the sheriff's desk with a thud that made everyone jump. The pages fluttered open, revealing columns of names and numbers, all written in a precise purple ink. Daniel gripped the bars of his cell, his knuckles white, trying to make sense of the script that held his life in its balance. "What you got there, ma'am?" Sheriff Garrison stammered, his voice trembling just enough to notice. Victoria's green eyes glittered. It was the look of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "I have been watching this town very closely for 6 weeks, Sheriff. I take notes. I ask questions. People, I find, are often eager to talk, especially when they think no one of importance is listening." She tapped a manicured finger on a specific page. "Did you know that nearly half the men working at the mine owe a significant amount of money to the Silver Dollar Saloon? Debts collected, quite forcefully, by Foreman Calloway." Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs. This was more than hope. This was a plan. A new voice cut through the tension. "That don't prove nothing." Deputy Morrison stood in the doorway, leading to the back office, his arms crossed over his chest. But his tough guy act was ruined by the sheen of sweat on his forehead, and the way his face had gone chalk white. Victoria didn't even flinch. She simply flipped to another page in her notebook. Foreman Calloway wasn't just a gambler, gentlemen. He was a record keeper. Meticulous. He kept a ledger of everyone who owed him money, when they paid and when they didn't. She ran her finger down a long list, her voice clear and cutting. Judge Crawford, $30. Dr. Henley, $25. A dozen other minors. And then we come to you, Deputy Morrison. She paused, letting the anticipation build until it was thick enough to choke on. $215. The largest debt on the entire page. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a graveyard silence, broken only by the tick-tock of the clock. Outside, the carpenters were done. The hammering had stopped. They were ready for him. Morrison's hand drifted instinctively towards the butt of his pistol. Sheriff Garrison, seeing the move, quickly stepped between them. Now hold on there, Morrison. Let the lady finish. Victoria offered a thin, cold smile. Oh, there's more, Sheriff. Much more. She reached back into her purse and pulled out a small cloth bag. It jingled with the unmistakable sound of coins. I found this, tucked away under a loose floorboard in the deputy's room at the boarding house just this morning. She untied the drawstring and emptied the contents onto her notebook. 37 silver dollars clattered onto the desk. Freshly minted. Straight from the mine. Daniel felt his stomach lurch. Stealing from the mine was a hanging offense all on its own. Morrison's face flushed a deep, blotchy red. You had no right, slinking around, going through my things. Actually, I did, Victoria stated, her voice as calm and steady as a surgeon's hand. You see, Deputy, I am not just Mr. Ashford's widow. I am his heir. I own a 40% share of this mine. When the official silver shipments started coming up short, month after month, I decided to come to Copper Creek and conduct a personal audit. Sheriff Garrison ran a hand through his thinning gray hair, his mind clearly struggling to keep up. Are you saying Morrison's been skimming silver? I'm saying someone has been stealing silver and cleverly blaming the discrepancies on Apache raids that, strangely, no one ever seemed to witness, Victoria corrected. She turned another page in her seemingly bottomless notebook. Someone with access to the shipping manifests. Someone who could change the numbers, just slightly, to cover their tracks. Someone like a deputy sheriff. Daniel felt a wave of dizziness wash over him, a volatile mix of hope and terror. If she was right, he might walk free. But she was accusing a lawman of murder and theft. If she was wrong, or if she couldn't prove it, Morrison would walk out of this jail, and they would both be dead before sundown. Morrison's hand was no longer drifting. It was resting firmly on the handle of his Colt. This is just crazy talk from a grieving widow who's lost her senses. You've got no proof. Then explain the coins, Deputy, Victoria said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Explain why the minting dates on those silver dollars perfectly match the dates of the last 3 missing shipments. The big clock on the wall chimed 10 times. 2 hours until noon. 2 hours until he was supposed to hang. But for the first time in 3 long days, Daniel Rivers didn't feel like he was going to die. He felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The church bells began to toll across Copper Creek, a slow, mournful sound calling the town to witness his death. But inside the jail, the script had been completely rewritten. Victoria Ashford stood like a general on a battlefield, calm and in command, while Deputy Morrison paced the floor like a caged wolf. You can't prove nothing, Morrison snarled for what felt like the 10th time. Finding a few coins doesn't make me a killer. It's a setup. Sheriff Garrison, meanwhile, was poring over Victoria's notebook, his eyes growing wider with every page he turned. He finally looked up, his face grim. Morrison, these records, they show every time silver went missing. And they show every time you made a large payment on your debt at the saloon. The dates match up. Perfect. Daniel watched through the bars as the crowd outside swelled. The picnic baskets and laughing children now seemed grotesque. They were here for a party, completely oblivious to the real drama unfolding just a few feet away. They wanted a hanging, and they were getting impatient. "Sheriff," Victoria said, her voice cutting cleanly through the rising tension. "I suggest you send one of your men to fetch Pastor Williams. I believe he may be able to provide the final piece of this puzzle." Garrison shook his head. "Pastor's been sick, down with a fever for nearly a week. Doc Henley says he's delirious, talking nonsense to people who ain't there." Victoria's eyebrows arched. "How convenient. Tell me, Sheriff, who has been looking after the good pastor during his illness? Who has been so kindly bringing him his meals?" Morrison froze mid-stride. The color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. He looked from Garrison to Victoria, his eyes wide with panic. "I did," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was just being neighborly." "Of course you were," Victoria purred, opening her notebook to a fresh blank page as if preparing to take a confession. "And I suppose it was just neighborly of you to deliver the medicine Doc Henley prescribed. Medicine that, when mixed with certain other herbs, could make a man confused, forgetful, perhaps even forget who he saw leaving the back of the saloon on the night Foreman Calloway was murdered." Daniel's jaw went slack. The pastor wasn't just sick. He was being poisoned. The one man in town who could have given him an alibi. Daniel had been helping him chop wood for the church that entire evening. Had been silenced. This wasn't just about greed anymore. This was a level of cold, calculated evil that made Daniel's stomach turn. Sheriff Garrison stood up so fast his chair clattered to the floor. His face was a mask of fury. "Morrison, empty your pockets, now! You can't order me around, Garrison. I'm a deputy." "Not anymore, you ain't," the sheriff growled, his hand dropping to his own sidearm. "Empty them pockets, or so help me God, I'll do it for you." With hands that shook uncontrollably, Morrison began pulling items out and dropping them on the desk. A ring of keys, a few stray coins, a folded sweat-stained piece of paper, and a small brown glass bottle with no label. Victoria picked up the bottle without hesitation. She uncorked it and took a delicate sniff. Her face wrinkled in disgust. "Laudanum. But it's been mixed with something else. Something that would cloud the mind and steal a man's memories." Outside, the crowd's murmur grew into a roar. Someone shouted, "Bring out the killer!" Another voice echoed, "Let's get this done!" The mob was getting restless. They could feel the delay, and they didn't like it. But inside the jail, the real killer was falling apart. Morrison backed away towards the door, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender that didn't look sincere. "This is all lies. You can't prove I did anything to the pastor. He's just a sick old man." "Actually," Victoria said, her voice dangerously quiet, "I can." She reached into her bag one more time and produced another book. It was a small, worn diary with a broken clasp. "Pastor Williams, even when he's sick, keeps a journal. He writes down everything. Old habits, as they say, die hard." She opened the diary to a page marked with a ribbon. She read aloud, her voice ringing with the weight of truth. "Tuesday. Morrison brought soup, tasted bitter. Felt strange after eating. Mind feels foggy. Saw my dear departed wife standing in the corner, but she's been gone these 5 years." Hope bloomed in Daniel's chest, a fragile but brilliant flower pushing its way through cracks in stone. He was going to live. He was actually going to live. Morrison's eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape that wasn't there. His hand was now fully wrapped around the handle of his gun. "None of you understand," he screamed, his voice cracking. "I needed that money. My wife, her medicine. It costs more than I make in a year. She'll die without it." "So you decided to let an innocent boy die in your place?" Victoria's voice was as cold as a winter wind whipping through a canyon. The church bells suddenly stopped ringing. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. Outside, a single voice rose above the crowd. "It's noon! It's time!" The mob began to surge towards the jailhouse, a wave of misguided fury, ready to drag Daniel to his execution. But Deputy Morrison was no longer thinking about Daniel's fate. He was thinking about his own. And in his terrified eyes, Daniel saw the unmistakable glint of a cornered animal about to do something desperate. Victoria's small derringer appeared in her hand as if by magic, its short, deadly barrel pointed straight at Deputy Morrison's heart. Across the room, Sheriff Garrison fumbled with the keys to Daniel's cell, his hand so sweaty he could barely fit the right one into the lock. The morning sun streamed through the dusty windows, cutting the room into bars of light and shadow, making the whole scene feel like a half-remembered nightmare. "Put your hands where I can see them, Deputy," Victoria commanded, her voice impossibly steady, a single point of calm in a swirling storm of chaos. Morrison's face was the color of old snow. His fingers twitched over the butt of his pistol, a man wrestling with the last, terrible decision of his life. Sheriff Garrison took a cautious step sideways, trying to create a clear line of fire without getting shot himself. "Ma'am, please, lower that weapon. We can handle this like civilized folks." "Civilized?" Victoria let out a short, sharp laugh, devoid of any humor. "Was it civilized when your deputy bashed in Foreman Calloway's skull to cover his theft? Was it civilized when he methodically poisoned a man of God? Was it civilized when he stood by and watched as this town prepared to hang an innocent boy for his crimes?" Daniel pressed his face against the bars, his world narrowed to this single, explosive moment. He watched this incredible woman, this stranger in midnight blue, risk her own life for his. Through the window, he saw the faces of the townsfolk, their expressions shifting from festive anticipation to confusion and anger as the raised voices from inside the jail reached them. They sensed something was wrong. Morrison's hand finally made its move, closing around his gun. "You're making a big mistake, lady. A real big mistake." "Am I?" Victoria replied, her eyes never leaving his. With her free hand, she reached into her silk purse again. She was a magician, and her purse held endless secrets. She pulled out a crumpled, greasy piece of paper covered in numbers and dates. "Then explain this, Deputy. I found it shoved under the mattress in your room this morning, along with the silver coins." The paper fluttered to the floor, landing between them like a dead leaf. Morrison's breathing became ragged, loud in the tense silence. It sounded like a horse that had been run too hard, for too long. "Those are the original mine shipment records," Victoria said, her voice dropping, each word a hammer blow. "The ones you were supposed to burn. The records that show, in your own handwriting, exactly how much silver you've been stealing for the last 6 months. The records that prove Calloway found you out and was using them to blackmail you. That was it, the final piece." With a roar that was more animal than human, Morrison lunged, not for his gun, but for her. He was going to take her down with him. Victoria's finger tightened on the trigger, the small gun ready to bark. But Sheriff Garrison was faster. He moved with a speed that defied his age and size. His big, calloused fist connected with Morrison's jaw. The sound was a sickening crack, like a dry branch snapping, and it echoed through the small room. The deputy crumpled. He hit the wooden floor like a sack of grain, his unfired pistol skittering across the dusty planks until it came to rest against the bars of Daniel's cell, just inches from his hand. For a long second, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Morrison groaned, a low, pathetic sound, and tried to push himself up on his elbows. "Stay down," Garrison ordered, his own weapon now drawn and aimed squarely at the man who had been his deputy just minutes before. He looked at Victoria, his expression a mixture of awe and exhaustion. "Ma'am, would you mind telling me exactly what else you found in that room?" Victoria slowly, deliberately, lowered her small pistol, though she kept it held ready at her side. "I found more than just stolen silver and incriminating records, Sheriff. I found letters from Calloway, threatening to expose him. I found a shirt, hidden behind the wash basin, still damp with blood. And I found this." She reached into her purse one last time. She pulled out an object that made Daniel's heart stop, then restart with a painful jolt. It was his hammer, the one with Dr. Sarchas carved into the handle, the one that had supposedly killed Calloway. But now, in the clear morning light, Daniel could see the dark, ugly stains that hadn't been there when it was stolen from him. Stains that could only be one thing: Morrison, dazed and bleeding from a split lip, managed to sit up. His deputy's badge was askew, mocking him. "You can't prove nothing with that. That old hammer. Could be anybody's." Victoria turned the tool over in her hands, her gaze burning into him. "Even with Daniel Rivers' initials carved plainly into the handle? Even when the blood staining the wood is a perfect match for the blood found at the scene of the murder?" Daniel just stared. He'd carved those initials himself 2 years ago, a lifetime ago, back when he still believed that honest work and good tools were all a man needed. Morrison's face went from pale to a ghastly shade of gray. His fight was gone. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice broken. "Calloway. He was bleeding this whole town dry. His demands just kept getting bigger. He would have ruined everyone. He would have ruined me." "So you killed him," Garrison said, his voice flat and heavy with disgust. "And you let this boy take the fall." Outside, the crowd was no longer just a confused murmur. It was an angry roar. Daniel could hear questions mixing with shouts for justice. But now, the target of their anger was shifting. Morrison staggered to his feet, swaying like a drunken man. He looked at Daniel, his eyes full of a strange, desperate kind of pleading. "That boy was nobody," he said, his voice rising, trying to justify the unjustifiable. "A drifter with no family, no friends. Who would have missed him?" The words struck Daniel with the force of a physical blow. In that single, terrible moment, he understood. To Morrison, to this town, his life had meant nothing. He wasn't a person. He was a solution to a problem, an inconvenient piece to be swept off the board. But Victoria Ashford had seen something else. She had looked at a nobody, a ghost, and decided he was worth saving. And as the sheriff finally managed to get the key in the lock and swing the cell door open, a new, terrifying question burned in Daniel's mind. What happens to the people brave enough to stand up for the nobodies of the world? Judge Crawford's black robes billowed behind him like storm clouds as he swept into the courthouse. The room was packed, suffocatingly hot. Every citizen of Copper Creek who could squeeze inside had done so, their faces a mixture of sweat, curiosity, and anger. This was better than a hanging. This was a reckoning. Daniel sat in the front row, his wrists raw but blessedly free of iron shackles. Across the room, in the defendant's chair where he himself had sat just hours ago, Deputy Morrison slumped, a broken man. The town's hero had become its villain overnight. "This court will come to order!" Judge Crawford's voice boomed, silencing the whispers. His gavel cracked against the wood. His gray beard, usually so stately, seemed to quiver with righteous indignation as he glared down at the accused. "Deputy Morrison, you stand accused of murder in the first degree, theft, and conspiracy to defraud the Copper Creek Mining Company. How do you plead?" A nervous, sweaty lawyer named Peters, who had arrived on the morning stage from Tucson, scrambled to his feet. "Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty, by reason of temporary madness, brought on by extreme financial hardship and duress." A low growl rumbled through the courtroom. Temporary madness. Daniel glanced at Victoria, seated beside him. She was a statue of composure in her black dress. But he saw her gloved hands clench her purse so tightly, her knuckles shone white through the fabric. Temporary madness? Judge Crawford's bushy eyebrows shot up towards his receding hairline. "Mr. Peters, are you seriously suggesting to this court that stealing company silver and murdering a man in cold blood can be excused because one has money troubles?" Before the flustered lawyer could answer, Sheriff Garrison stood from his seat near the back of the room. "Your Honor, if I may, we have more evidence. Evidence that came to light this morning." The judge nodded curtly. Garrison walked forward, carrying a wooden crate Daniel recognized from Morrison's room at the boarding house. "Mrs. Ashford's investigation uncovered these letters between Morrison and a known silver buyer in Phoenix. It seems, Your Honor, that this wasn't the first mine he's stolen from." The crowd gasped. Morrison wasn't just a desperate man. He was a professional criminal. Victoria then rose gracefully to her feet, commanding the room's attention. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to present evidence that shows a pattern of behavior, a pattern of theft dating back 3 years. It seems Deputy Morrison has made a career of moving from one boomtown to the next, taking jobs in law enforcement specifically to gain access and cover his criminal activities. Daniel watched, completely mesmerized, as Victoria opened her own leather satchel and produced a stack of papers as thick as a church Bible. She hadn't just solved a murder, she had unraveled a man's entire secret life. Suddenly, Morrison leaped from his chair, his face a mask of purple rage. "You witch!" he screamed, his voice raw with desperation. "You had no right, poking through my things, reading my private letters. This is all lies, lies and slander." "Sit down, Mr. Morrison," Judge Crawford ordered, banging his gavel repeatedly. But Morrison was beyond reason. He pointed a trembling, accusing finger at Victoria. "She's been asking questions all over town, stirring up trouble where there was none. She's not even from here. Why should any of you believe this? This fancy city woman over one of your own?" The courtroom exploded. Morrison's words had struck a nerve. Arguments erupted, with some people shouting their support for the disgraced deputy, while others yelled him down. Daniel felt a cold knot of fear tighten in his stomach. He saw how quickly the tide could turn. Victoria was an outsider, a wealthy widow with secrets of her own. What if the town decided they trusted the devil they knew over the angel they didn't? But Victoria remained perfectly still in the eye of the storm. When Judge Crawford's gavel finally hammered the room back into a semblance of order, she spoke. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried to every corner. "I came to Copper Creek because my husband invested his life savings in this mine," she said simply. "When his letters from his partner, Foreman Calloway, suddenly stopped arriving, I knew something was terribly wrong. I did not come here to stir up trouble. I came here to find the truth." She turned, her emerald eyes locking directly onto Morrison. "The truth is that you murdered a man in cold blood to cover your crimes. The truth is that you were willing to let an innocent boy die to save your own skin. And the truth is that this town deserves better than a lawman who puts his own greed above the very law he swore an oath to uphold." The fight seemed to drain out of Morrison all at once. His shoulders slumped, his head bowed. In that moment, he wasn't a monster. He was just a weak, pathetic man who had made one terrible choice, and then 100 more trying to outrun it. Judge Crawford's face was grim. "This court has heard enough." His gavel came down with a sound of absolute finality. "Deputy Morrison, this court finds you guilty of murder in the 1st degree. You will be taken from this place to the jail, and there you will remain until dawn tomorrow, at which time you will be hanged by the neck until you are dead." A wave of murmurs and nods swept through the crowd as they began to file out. Justice had been served. But as Daniel watched them lead the sobbing Morrison away, he felt a strange cocktail of relief and sorrow. A man would die tomorrow. And while he deserved it, death always left a shadow. Victoria touched his arm, her touch gentle. "Are you all right, Daniel?" He looked into her eyes and saw something he'd never seen from anyone before. It was genuine concern, mixed with a deeper warmth, something that made his heart beat a little faster. His future, which just this morning had been a black, empty void, suddenly seemed full of possibilities he'd never dared to imagine. "I'm better than all right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thanks to you, I'm alive." But as they walked out of the courthouse together into the blazing afternoon sun, a single nagging thought troubled him. Morrison was a thief, yes, a poisoner, and a murderer. But could a man like that, a man so easily broken, have orchestrated all of this on his own? The meticulous changing of the records, the convenient timing of the pastor's illness, the perfect framing of an innocent man, it all felt too clean, too smart. It felt like Morrison had been a pawn in a much larger game, and Daniel couldn't shake the terrifying feeling that the real king was still on the board. The letter arrived 3 months later, on a Tuesday morning so bright and peaceful you'd never guess the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of Copper Creek. Daniel was hammering nails into the frame of the new schoolhouse, a project funded entirely by Victoria. He felt the sun on his back and the solid weight of the hammer in his hand. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was building something permanent. He felt like he belonged. Then a rider appeared, a stranger on a lathered horse, kicking up a cloud of dust. He was a postal rider, and he had an urgent dispatch from the territorial capital in Prescott. "You Daniel Rivers?" the rider asked, swinging down from his saddle. "I am," Daniel said, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. "Got word from the capital. They're sending federal marshals. Seems the investigation into the Copper Creek mine didn't end with Deputy Morrison." Daniel's hammer slipped from his grasp, clattering onto the wooden planks. The rider continued, his voice low and serious. "They believe Morrison wasn't working alone. They think someone higher up was feeding him information about the silver shipments. Someone who doctored the main ledgers in the assay office, not just the transport manifests. Someone still living right here in Copper Creek." Victoria appeared at his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Her green eyes were sharp with concern. "What is it, Daniel?" "Morrison had a partner," Daniel whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "And they think I saw something that night. Something I don't even remember seeing." He racked his brain. The night of the murder. He'd been with the pastor, but on his way home, he'd cut through the alley behind the Silver Dollar Saloon. It had been dark. He remembered hearing voices, an argument, but he'd kept his head down and hurried on. He hadn't seen any faces. Or had he? The rider handed Victoria a sealed envelope. "The marshals will be here next week. They'll want to question everyone who knew Foreman Calloway." He then looked around, making sure no one was listening, before leaning in closer. "But ma'am, that ain't all. There's been talk. Word is, someone's put a bounty on Mr. Rivers' head. $500, paid to the man who makes sure the star witness can't testify." Victoria's face went bone white beneath the wide brim of her hat. All around them, the cheerful sounds of construction, the sawing of wood, the shouts of the workers, suddenly sounded distant and hollow. The peaceful town square felt like a trap. Just then, from the main road at the edge of town, came the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Not one horse, but several. And they weren't moving at a casual pace. They were riding hard. "How many men?" Victoria asked the rider, her voice a strained whisper. "3, maybe 4 by the sound of it." "Professional killers, from what I heard in the last town," the rider added grimly. "They don't ask questions." Daniel felt that old familiar fear settle onto his shoulders like a shroud. But this time, it was different. 3 months ago, he was a nobody with nothing to lose. Now, he had everything. He had a future. He had Victoria. He had to figure out what deadly secret was buried in his memory before those riders figured it out for him. The real question wasn't whether he could survive another attempt on his life. It was whether he could protect the woman who had already risked everything to save him once. And as the hoofbeats grew louder, closer, he knew the answer had to be yes. The showdown came at sunset. The Arizona sky was painted in brutal shades of blood orange and deep purple. Daniel stood alone in the middle of Main Street. The hammer felt strange in his hand. Not a tool for building, but a weapon of last resort. 4 riders fanned out before him, their horses kicking up dust, forming a half circle like buzzards waiting for something to die. "This don't have to get ugly, boy," their leader called out. He was a hard-faced man with a jagged scar across one cheek and teeth capped in silver that glinted in the dying light. "We just need you to take a little ride with us. Answer a few questions about what you saw in that alley behind the saloon." But it was too late. As they'd ridden into town, something had clicked. The sound of a voice from his memory, sharp and angry. It wasn't Morrison's voice he'd heard that night. It was deeper, more commanding. As the bounty hunters had circled him, he'd seen a face watching from the courthouse window, and the memory had exploded in his mind like a flash of lightning. He now remembered it all. The argument in the alley. Foreman Calloway, his face illuminated by a lantern, holding up a ledger. And the other man, his face contorted with rage. The man who had almost sent him to the gallows. "I remember everything now," Daniel shouted back, his voice ringing with newfound certainty. "I remember the argument. I remember the ledger. And I remember who was really in charge of this whole rotten scheme." Just then, a side door of the general store creaked open. Victoria stepped out, no longer the picture of a grieving widow. In her hands, she held a Winchester rifle, and she held it like she knew exactly how to use it. But she wasn't aiming at the bounty hunters. She was aiming higher, towards the second-story window of the courthouse, where a figure was trying to slip away unnoticed. "Going somewhere, Your Honor?" she called out, her voice clear as a bell. It was Judge Crawford. The bounty hunters hesitated, their confidence broken by this shocking turn of events. Their employer was being called out in the middle of the street. That moment of confusion was all Daniel needed. From the doorways of the saloon and the blacksmith shop, Sheriff Garrison and 3 of the toughest miners in Copper Creek emerged, their own rifles leveled. The hunters were surrounded, their odds suddenly, catastrophically, reversed. "It's over, Crawford!" Garrison yelled up at the window. "The federal marshals are already on their way. They're reading your private letters as we speak, the ones that detail every ounce of territorial silver you've been stealing to pay off your gambling debts in California." Judge Crawford's proud, authoritative face crumpled like a piece of wet paper. He leaned out the window, his voice a pathetic whine. "You don't understand! I owe dangerous people! They would have killed me!" "So you decided to have Foreman Calloway killed instead?" Victoria's voice was ice. "And then you tried to hang an innocent boy to cover your tracks? How noble." The bounty hunters, seeing their paymaster exposed and their lives in peril, slowly, carefully, raised their hands in surrender. Some paydays just weren't worth dying for. 2 weeks later, Daniel stood beside Victoria under a canopy of desert stars. The entire town of Copper Creek was there, not for a hanging, but for a wedding. Pastor Williams, fully recovered from his mysterious illness, performed the ceremony. The town square, where the gallows had once stood, was now filled with fiddle music and laughter. As he and Victoria took their first dance, he leaned in and whispered in her ear, "You saved my life, twice." She smiled, her emerald eyes sparkling in the lantern light. "And you saved mine right back," she replied, "by showing me that some things, and some people, are worth fighting for." The celebrations swirled around them, a joyous, noisy testament to their unlikely victory. Daniel realized that sometimes, telling the truth is the most dangerous thing a person can do. But sometimes, if you are very brave, and very, very lucky, the truth doesn't just set you free. It sets everyone free. The bounty on his head was gone, the corruption was rooted out, and the incredible woman in his arms had proven that love, courage, and a well-hidden derringer could conquer just about anything. If you enjoyed this story of justice in the Old West, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button for more tales of mystery and suspense.